Let me ask you this. Is your identity performative or conceptual? I mean, in specific, is it the product of a materialistic dialectic, or do you hold to it as being apodictic truth? I mean, one would be inclined to think that any such interpretation would imbricate on heterodox definitions of, logocentric meta-narratives. But if I, in inhabiting my role as an interlocutor, I have transgressed my felt sense of appropriate elenchi, then feel free to return to me an aporetic stare. You parse all that? Did it sound like word salad? Because it was. I mean, it sort of had some seeming sense. It used a lot of words. It used a lot of Greek words. It used a lot of neologistic words. It used a lot of made-up bullshit. That seems to be sort of the flavor du jour in what we term postmodern learning. And it's this specific element that I want to kind of zoom in on prior to launching into the critique I wanted to make of this Richard Wolff video. Now, this is not an accusation. This specific piece, the logoria part, isn't an accusation of Richard Wolff in specific. Of the one thing I will give him is that for a Marxist, he is a Marxist. He hasn't decided to matriculate upwards into the complete sheer lunacy of, modernism, postmodernism, structuralism, and all of that hoo-ha, where all of a sudden they've just decided to inhabit the rarefied air of the, intellectually incomprehensible. But nevertheless, his logic is just as fraught with just gems of nonsense. Now, the reason I picked on these idiotic words is a trait. The trait that doesn't necessarily pop up in just postmodernism. Its specific display of words does, but the root of it actually goes even beyond Marx. Because Marx didn't happen in a vacuum. Marx styled himself a Hegelian, and Hegel styled himself a Kantian. There's all that little Kant. Immanuel Kant came to be at a time when the area that we would later know as Germany was suffering some, let's say, appropriate performance issues. It needed to reestablish its former glory, because you see, Napoleon had just gotten through just beating the holy crap out of all of Europe. And, Prussians had one time been sort of the elite troops and blah, blah, blah. And they had sort of fallen into a little bit of a lull. And the Holy Roman Empire, title that they have long held, gone. And the days of, the Germanic king riding into the Crusades and being the deciding force, those are gone. So all of those eons of bravery were long, long, long gone. And they had gone through a period of just turmoil of small little kingdoms fighting one another. So they weren't necessarily they didn't have a unity. And when Kant came around, and he was, I'm not taking anything away from him. He was a good philosopher, but like all philosophers, you tend to look at the age that just closed, and you kind of need to take issue with it and spin your own little, gem to distinguish yourself. And he saw the Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reason, as being sort of a departure from that to religion. I don't know. He parsed it, and he still had a fair amount of reverence of the divine, but he was so enamored with reason that he jumped the shark in a few key points. And this is just, I love philosophy, but there is a very clear line between the empirical sciences and philosophy, the soft science, the soft, materia. Because there are certain concepts that are transferable and certain ones that are not. One such concept was relativity. Relativity, you might know, you might know it from Einstein, but it really had been introduced by Tycho Brahe. So when Newton kind of figured out the law of gravitation and mass and all that stuff, and figured out how you could explain how two celestial bodies interacted, Tycho Brahe was one of these guys that meticulously recorded every single position of the stars every single day, had one of the most detailed records, and postulated this idea of relativity, which is you're trying to gauge that he was the first one to introduce I think the three laws of celestial dynamics around how much of an arc, how much of the arc a given planet sweeps in its orbit, and a few others. But in any case, for you to be able to measure the position or the speed of a given object, you have a point at which you are referring that object from. Namely, being on Earth, you're on, here, that's your point, that's your frame of reference. And given that we know the Earth moves, you are on one inertial frame of reference, one that's moving. You have to take that into account if, for example, you need to calculate that speed from another point of reference. But the idea was that everything is relative to where you are standing and looking at it from. That seems a pretty reasonable observation. And, many such observations exist in physics and in chemistry and all that stuff. A famous one was, the oldest one, atomism, back in Didactus. Anyway, back in Greek times, they figured out that, hey, stuff can be broken into smaller stuff, and eventually there'll be something you can't break. And it was just a proposition. Philosophy took that and made it into reductionism. So philosophy took relativity. And here's where it just jumped the shark, because not being a very empirical science, it does not necessarily make use of mathematical laws often. If it did, like physics does, it would very quickly discover an exception case. When you try to plot out something, you very quickly find the impossible combinations that you should stay away from. And in this relativity thing, you get to hit one of the classic logic bombs, the sort of divide by zero logic bomb that, in effect, makes everything else invalid. So, just because there are multiple points, theoretically an infinite number of points that would shift your frame of reference, so in effect something that you might consider objective, when you consider its opposite to be subjective, and then you realize that the subjective can have a million permutations, the conclusion you might be inclined to draw is that no subjective point of view should be any better than any other subjective point of view. Then, therefore, any subjective point of view doesn't have intrinsic value because it's no better than any other. So, in philosophy, you sort of conjugate that all the way up to elements like truth. Your truth is subjective, therefore it's valueless. Your morals are subjective. Everything is relative. So your morals can't be privileged over my morals. Your culture can be privileged over my culture. All of those things. Which, just the existence of a possible infinity does not negate the existence of 2 points and being compared to one another. That's kind of the point of relativity. And so the interpretation of such relativity was exactly backwards. So Mr. Kant borrowed that little concept and forever saddled us with the idea of moral relativity and cultural relativity in general in philosophy. And then within that, and I'm not sure if one caused the other or this one caused this next one, but the next one was another whopper, which is critical theory. Not sure that that was the exact term from him, because critical theory as a discipline came on later, but the idea that, you might be familiar with that old saying that history is written by the victor. Therefore, one might be inclined to think, well, gee, what if am I being lied to? Is that the appropriate history? Is there another side? If there's another side, there could be infinite sides, blah, 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 blah. Well, this one, he makes another sort of logical leap to say, since history is written by the victor, since everything in history is barbaric and it's a flash of power, realistically, we should interpret literature, history, whatever, through a dialect, through a lens of a power dynamic, meaning an oppressed and an oppressor. It wasn't necessarily articulated in that fashion, but the power dynamic, the idea of a winner-loser thing was there. Those are two whoppers. Now, they were interesting, they were worth discussing, and he had many other such findings. Those are less challenging, and his critique of pure reason. And then, again, needing many, many heroes so they can reaffirm the strength of, German intelligence, they very immediately sort of, there was a sort of an exegesis. There was a elevation of Mr. Kant. So, even though some of his contemporaries accused him of being obscurant, obscuring portions of the truth, in effect, not telling a full story, aka lying. Well, and then Hegel comes around and he goes, hold my beer. And he proceeds into writing. Now, if obscurant is to obscure some portions of the truth, Hegel took that to unprecedented heights of achievement, because his style of writing was so tortuous, it seems like as he was expressing himself, I think that's a lot of where that later sort of grandiloquence comes from postmodernism, because whereas Kant was a very crisp writer, Hegel was the exact opposite of that. In fact, many of his contemporaries didn't think he was fit to hold any sort of teaching post. Yet, fast forward a few more years, and now Hegel is heralded with Kant as being just amazing at discovering the phenomenology of spirit and the Geist and all of that shit. So, obscurantism, living well. So here comes Marx. Now let's talk a little bit about Marx. Because Marx, there's a few things you ought to know about Marx the person before you begin to just casually refer to his genius as an economist, his genius as a political observer, because he was neither. So Homie was born to a decent family. He was third of 9 kids. About a year after his birth, the oldest son died, making him the eldest male. About 17, he went off to college, tried to go to Berlin, tried to go to Bonn. His dad wanted him to study law. His dad had homeschooled him, because his dad was a fairly good didact. He was an attorney, and he himself was a little bit of a shit stirrer. He was an activist. He had the sort of he had been the rabble rouser that allowed Prussia to adopt a constitution. So those early reactionary views were embedded in him. And then at 17, off he goes to college. Dad says, study law so you can make some money, and he sucks at it. So he goes and decides that he likes Hegel. He's going to be a philosopher. He's going to write, and he's going to be a philosopher. And so he tries to submit a thesis in one place or another. It doesn't work in Berlin, doesn't work in Bonn, so he goes to Jena. University of Jena is kind of like going to Chico State, where they take him and he gets his degree. In all of that, his father dies, leaving him the, head of the household. And at no point does he decide, oh shit, I should maybe head back home and assume my role as now the, responsible adult of this family. No. He just kind of lets mom go on and do her best, because there's still a little bit of money left. And he proceeds to continue his studies because he wants to be a philosopher and write. And here's sort of the character, because he writes about the class struggle of labor, the proletariat versus the bourgeois. Well, he's neither, because he's sort of in the social crust of the bourgeois, but he has limited money. He has throughout his life, he has always been in debt. Even after his mother dies and leaves him a small amount of an inheritance, that goes to pay off some of his debt, and he immediately incurs more debt. So at no point was he anything remotely resembling solvent. Married a baroness. He was engaged with a baroness that came from an aristocratic family, a liberal aristocratic family. So he was always sort of sniffing around money, admiring money from the outside, but never quite possessing it. Once he latched onto Engels, Engels had a factory in England and some other concerns, and Engels provided him quite a bit, but never did he quite manage to secure that which he wrote about, namely capital. The other thing that he wrote about, the proletariat, he never quite visited. So when you think about his proletariat, you would think that maybe he had a lot of friends with dirt under their fingernails, or he went and examined, factories or whatever. No, not so much. In fact, every time that Engels, in the later years, when Engels, had to assume his father's role and he had to put in some time at the factory in a managerial capacity, whenever he would ask Marx to join him, Marx would happily decline. In fact, he actually had kind of a disdain for that working class, because those working class people tended not to be educated. So they didn't have a theory to come, to speak from. And that's the only thing that gave it authority. Now you would think, well, then how did he gather his appreciation of the working class? Well, England at the time, or all of Europe at the time, all of the world at the time, was going through basically the Industrial Revolution. And that was transformative. So as you might imagine, as you're in the process of, establishing some factory that processes something, breaking up or creating some foundry or whatever, invariably things like, occupational safety hazards are bound to, people are just inventing shit for the first time. So accidents abounded. And being a responsible country, England instituted an office of inspectors that basically was focused on inspecting the conditions of work in all of these, companies popping up everywhere, to make sure that worker safety and just general, life and limb were preserved. And invariably, they would publish the results of the ones that didn't. And of course, Marx used these things as sort of the de facto display of, look how shitty it would be to work in this world. So to him, that sort of was the universe of the proletariat. So unfortunately, he got a very jaundiced view of both capital and the, that plebe class of the worker. He had no concept of agrarian culture, which later on proved very problematic for the Soviets. And he really had no concept of beyond the word capital. And you'll see this in Mr. Wolff's utterly, his descriptions are utterly devoid of detail. And that's exactly where you'll notice the lack of detail. Capital is this thing. It's like the rich. The rich have money. Now, we don't know how they got it. We don't know what that money means. We don't know that what that money's spent for. It's just, there's two things in the world. There's capital and there's labor, and that's all there is. Which is just the most asinine, naive, overly simplistic view ever. Now, his two big claims to fame, Marx, was Das Kapital, the Bible about capital, which is the economic tome. Mind you, never studied a lick of economics. At best, autodidactically picked it up, but not through, any sort of experiential thing, but rather just parking his ass at the library and reading this guy, reading that guy. So yes, while he might have picked up some economic theory from books, it wasn't taught, it wasn't mentored, and it definitely wasn't practiced. And furthermore, he seemed to have allergy at being exposed to it, and in the micro universe that were his finances, he definitely failed big time. And that too, and he was also basically continuously drunk, at least for a good second half of his life. So, on the second half of his legacy is the Communist Manifesto, which one would think, if you're trying to paint a picture of future utopia of a government, then you have an appreciation of the complexity of what a government is, and how you would take, say, Model A, whatever it is that you hate, capitalism, blah, 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 how do you transition it to Model B, that utopia? Nah, not so much. No, the main thing is point at all these things that, according to your view, are wrong, and how they just need to disappear. That's a lacuna that ended up being filled in by, the logical thing is when you say thing A is bad, thing B is good, then that means you just kind of destroy thing A, right? And so when the Russians or the Nazis or everybody else had to implement it, they just kind of, removed all those people. Hence the large number of bodies associated with implemented Marxism. So that's Marx. Let's just park there for a minute. And now we'll launch into Mr. Wolff. Actually, before we do, allow me to just present some of my bona fides, or lack thereof. I am not in any way, shape, or form a Marxist philosopher. Let me be specific. I have not had the privilege of studying Marxism in the hallowed halls of U.S. higher education, as obviously Mr. Wolff has. I am not a native-born American. I am a naturalized American. I've had the fortune, or misfortune, depending on which way you want to look at it, of being born in communist Romania and being raised there in the 70s. So while I did not study this, and I'm distinguishing the American taught Marxism from Marxism learned in a Marxist practicing country, because evidently there is something innately wonderful about this American taught Marxism, because it seems to have a plethora of support here. People are just, overflowing, effusive in their support of that Marxism. The Marxism I was exposed to, let's call that my quote-unquote lived experience, as the kids say nowadays, was being, of course, taught in schools, taught, I would say force-fed, really. Dialectic materialism, the struggle of the proletariat, the blah, 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 all of the good stuff, Oppressors being, anything material, any acquisition of material goods would be equivalent to, historical oppression, all of that good shit. And then, of course, seeing it in practice and having a pretty fresh history of a time when, say, my grandfather, who had some businesses, the process by which they went about acquiring them, living in, the front room of a multi-room mansion whose owner now was relegated to live in the back room of, things like that. You sort of saw the practical applicability of socialism. So where I differ in my view of socialism is that if you are an American and studied socialism here and have not lived elsewhere, then you have to compare country A, which is America, fundamentally a successful country, with country B. And country B now becomes a fictitious utopian country, that which socialism describes as an ideal end state as a country, right? And any example of reality is just usually pointing to the other side of the map, to a place where you've never been, and you're probably distrustful of being faithfully interpreted. Whereas my experience, unfortunately, is based on country A, the one I was born in, and saw some significant amount of deprivations, deaths, bad shit. And then seeing country B, which in my estimation was significantly better, marked improvement, I would say. So that would be the polarization of one's views. So without further ado, I come across this video. It's Debunking Jordan Petersen's Cultural Marxism with Richard Wolff, and it was part of Empire Files with Abbie Martin. I've watched Abbie before. I kind of saw her as a, champion of the little guy. And, she had her little run-ins with RT, but she didn't seem like she had gone overly communistic. So I thought, okay, let me see her take on this, because it seems, especially nowadays, the world's gone very polar. So we'll see if that cracks her. And it did. And then, of course, in this video, he references another video, so I'm pulling that up too, which is Richard Wolff responds to Jordan B. Petersen. In both, let me just kind of highlight the fact that he's responding to questions that either Jordan never said, or he's taking the, let's just say, the least generous interpretation of what he said, and provides critique in this sort of formulaic approach. He'll reference a concept and typically be snarky or sneer and kind of claim, well, it's obvious that Jordan has read little of blah, blah, blah. It's, knock down Jordan's understanding of Marxism and either stop there or then go on to explain the concept by repeating how insulting it was that Jordan got it wrong. And if he continues, basically just string a number of assertions without any kind of support, and sometimes not even sort of related to one another, or just falsehoods. Now, I'm accustomed to the dialectic being Well, you propose this. What is your supporting evidence? And you list it. And then you get some, contradictory, you get some attacks on your supposition, and you have to defend them. But this concept of defending one's views by simply blaming the other guy by saying, well, that's obvious that you haven't read it, without actually having a dialogue, it seems a little, whatever. So let's start.
So right-wing figures like Steve Bannon, Jordan Peterson, use this term cultural Marxism.
Now, right off the bat, Jordan Peterson, Steve Bannon. Really? First of all, Steve Bannon is not listed. Never did he, I don't think he just debated cultural Marxism with anyone or opened for a debate or called for a debate. Isn't that a nice little smear tactic? Because, the left's done a good job of smearing Steve Bannon. I don't know. Some of it might have been deserved. I know some of it probably hasn't been, but he's a nationalist. The accusation is he's an ethno-nationalist. I don't know if that's true, but even if it is, whatever. There's a negative miasma. Why bundle them? They're not birds of a feather. One's an academic, a self-identified original lefty liberal who basically just cast off the identitarian pieces of the left and the right. He has revulsion against those, hence Marxism, Leninism, fascism, all the isms. Otherwise, life, liberty, and all that bullshit, he's all good with. At no point is he saying, America for Americans or anything like that. So why bundle him? But okay. So she's addressing this term, cultural Marxism.
The so-called moral rot of our society as kind of analogous to Marxism. So first talk about what you think cultural Marxism is in terms of how they're applying it and your response to this theory.
Okay, so it's a theory. So the question would be, is cultural Marxism, I'm reading it as, why are they making up this thing called cultural Marxism? And that's kind of a puzzling thing, because I thought cultural Marxism, kind of was an approved thing, but okay. And it sparked in my mind the fact that this response Jordan has met before. I mean, there just seems to be sort of a little nerve that triggers lefties that, what do you mean cultural Marxism? What are you talking about? There's just like two students at a college somewhere, you're making it like it's a big deal. But because it's repeated in multiple interviews, I'm like, Because when he was being interviewed by the Irish guy, he asked it. When he was interviewed in Australia, that guy asked it. When he was interviewed by the girl at GQ, she made it seem like a big deal. And it was like this strange little focus.
Well, the irony, and perhaps there's a deep meaning to it. The irony is that cultural Marxism is a derivative of a term called cultural Bolshevism, which meant basically the same thing.
Oh, so it is a thing.
By the Nazis in Germany.
Oh, it was invented by the Nazis. Huh. Who'd have thunk it?
As a way of organizing the German population to be critical of everything to the left of the Nazis. They were all either dupes of the communists that lay behind them or wittingly doing their dirty work.
Let's pause there, because that's another beautiful sleight of hand. Everything to the left of the Nazis. So, A, it was created by the Nazis. The Nazis were something outside of this Marxism thing. And they obviously must have been to the right, because he's pointing to the left. Well, Karl Marx came with his ideas before Nazism, right? And now, not clear that, they were directly translated by Hitler, but who's this guy? Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, who was the sort of grand poobah philosopher of the fascists, was the first one to kind of identify the very first rev, let's say Marxism V2. And what was the problem that Marxism had? Well, Marx, in the 1800s, kept, in his role of grand prophet, kept predicting this destabilization of society being caused by the two classes sort of clashing. The, workers of the world unite and rise up and, cast off your chains and beat up the capitalist class. And that kept not happening. What did happen was World War I. And in World War I, a funny thing was observed. Them dumb plebes in France, those little proletariats, had guns and were put in a battle, and on the other side were those other dumb plebes from Germany with guns. They were same class, and they fought no problem. They didn't unite. So he kind of stumbled on this little trick that, hey, you know what? Maybe class isn't the glue. Maybe the stronger identifier is nation. So let's make it, I don't know, National Socialism, which, surprise, that's in German, in, abbreviated form, that's Nazi. So you see this little rigmarole that he tries to play here? That has been sort of the game that left has played forever, which is, oh, I'm sorry, Hitler's on the right. No. Not on the right. On the right, let's kind of put left and right to bed before we move any further. If I ask you, do you know what left or right is? Many of you will very assuredly tell me you do. So I'm going to try and challenge that. Now, long time ago, there were some discussions in France about, this king that they had and they kind of didn't want to have. And it went through a series of phases. This was after America got its independence, so the French thought, hey, hold my beer, I'll try too. And they pretty much, they killed the feudal system. And as they were trying to kind of move past the feudal system, again, that whole revolution thing without a whole lot of planning underneath, they were having trouble. So the transition process was less than smooth. And then they abolished the monarchy, and that was kind of a little frisson that went through Europe. But they just kind of jailed the king and told him to sit quiet. And eventually, just they were so frustrated in the transition that there became a little schism. Now, here's the tricky part. This was the beginning of something called the Terror. And the people that had taken over the halls of government, before the government of France was the État Général, the first estate, second estate, third estate, nobles, clergy, blah, blah, blah. Now it was the National Assembly. So in the National Assembly hall were two groups. The Jacobins, also known as the Montagnards, and the Girondins. Now, there's a little hint here. The revolution had already happened. Them plebes, the people, the sans-culottes, they already kind of, upended everything, did all that. So that was phase one. That's done. Now these two groups that are harping at each other are all nobles or bourgeoisie. There's no sans-culottes among them. They're both anti-monarchy. They have both abolished monarchy. That's done. They're both about democracy. They pretty much are in agreement, except for one kind of different approach to what's next. One is radical and one is moderate. When I mean radical, I'm talking about the one led by Robespierre. I'm talking guillotine and wanting to get all those bastards to pay for what they've done. And the other side, which Ronald, I think. Anyways, I forget the French guys, but the part that I'm focused on, Thomas Paine, one of the Americans, was there visiting and was attempting to infuse them with some sort of conservatism. And conservatism in this case was literally like, hey, let's take it easy. Let's look at the system we have and make changes as opposed to just blowing shit up. So here's the blowing shit up side. Here's the incremental side. The Jacobins win and the guillotine runs nonstop for a year. It kills the king. It kills Marie Antoinette. It kills even Lavoisier, who was one of their top chemists because, he had a side job collecting taxes. And that was, evidently a death sentence. That's what left and right means. And you know where they got it? Because in the National Assembly, one group was on the right wing of the hall, and the other group was in the left wing of the hall. There's nothing in right or left that has to do with liberty, that has to do with, equality amongst everybody else, whatever. All of those things were present everywhere. Now, if you look, the fundamental difference between the French system is how they engaged in assigning their rights. If you look at the declaration, the Bill of rights for men and citizens, which is the declaration that they have, is, in the first article, social distinction can be based only upon benefit for the community. Sovereignty has its origins essentially in the nation. No organization nor individual may exercise any authority that does not expressly come from there. So, key distinction point. The nation, the state, gives you rights. Without it, you are nothing. Therefore, the value of life, the value of the individual is zip. Contrast that to how the Americans did that a few years earlier. The Americans said rights are endowed by Creator, inalienable, and it wasn't that the rights are not given by the government, they are protected by the government from being infringed upon. It may seem like a small difference, but it is the difference that has separated America from all nations in all time. That's the key distinction. And now let's go back to Monsieur Wolff and see what he's got to say.
Of spreading secretly and in the schools and in the films and in the museums this kind of evil Bolshevism. There's therefore some symbolic interest in the fact that Jordan Petersen or Steve Bannon would find in their minds...
I love that Steve Bannon keeps getting mentioned even though he's got no part in this.
The same phrase to play the same game.
Why Steve Bannon? Why not just say Hitler?
To argue that somehow, insidiously, the Democrats, liberals, everything left of where they are is somehow infected by a dangerous disease. It is hallucinatory, it's nutty, but it can serve as a way to organize people.
Okay, it's hallucinatory, it's an infectious disease, it's crazy, it's nutty, blah, blah, blah. What is this thing? The cultural thingy? The cultural Marxism. So let us look at, I don't know, let's just search online. If you search on cultural Marxism, you get the Frankfurt School as being sort of a suggested. And of course, I'm not a big fan of Wikipedia because unfortunately our, writing class is long, has gone through the hallowed halls of America, and writing in America, journalism especially, you're going to learn from, a liberal professor who's got insane Marxist leanings. So, but when you go to like Urban Dictionary, those tend to be sort of those counter reactionaries, and they kind of are painting a picture around SJW as being sort of a, the cause between the driver of this cultural Marxism. But let's go to Frankfurt School because that would be viable, respected. Now, most definitely, Frankfurt School is Marxist, and they say that. Well, look, they got the little picture. So okay, now if I say cultural Marxism, would that be just Marxism being applied to culture? I mean, that seems like a valuable, valid definition. If I were to say, I don't know, find it on the page. Culture, if I could spell, I'd be dangerous. Cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. See? Wow, almost the same terms. Cultural Marxism, right-wing, anti-Semitic. Oh, now it's anti-Semitic. Oh, we hadn't mentioned any Semites, but okay. Not racist too? It's a da-da-da-da-da-da-da, which is meant to, okay. So wait, it's conspiracy theory, trying to conflate what, well, there was a counterculture in the 60s, right? I mean, that existed, right? That established a pretty interesting sort of disinhibition from the mores of sexual, sexual crudity that had reigned supreme here. And what was the guy's name that... Yeah, he was a Frankfurt School guy. Herbert Marcuse. I remember. He wrote this great book. I mean, he wrote many great books, but he wrote this great one called Eros and Civilization, which really kind of had to do with Eros being sort of the symbolism of, free love, and how acquiring as much free love as possible was sort of the ultimate expression of the self. And Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. The 60s were launched. So tell me again how that didn't lead to Marxism didn't contribute in cultural Marxism. I'm sorry, I'm not following that one. But okay, let's just say it's my hallucinatory perception.
And it doesn't have
They can be hateful.
application in Marxist theory.
Doesn't come out of Marxism. Marx never discussed anything like cultural Marxism. Marxists in general haven't. The closest Marxists came to something like that was to be interested in the role culture plays in shaping capitalism. Capitalism affects
Okay, I got it. He was interested in culture shaping capitalism, and he discussed it, and therefore, in today's day and age, it would be logical that Marxism evolved to focus on culture, like Marx said.
We're doing a program on.
But hey, since Marx didn't engage in it directly, then it must not be Marxist, huh?
Economy of our society. So they were interested.
That is an example. That is a counter that you'll hear too, which is again completely illogical. Which is, why do people attack Marxism? Marxism happened a long time ago. Well, yeah, it's the root of a series of perversions, a series of versions that came out of it. And let's look at how it performed then. Then we look at version 2, how that performed. Version 3, how that performed. And you can only look at it in its age, because that's when it performed.
Interplay between economics and culture, and so they would do that kind of analysis, but they never called it cultural Marxism. They talked about Marxism's interest in culture, but that's really the closest they came.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of going around and around and around about basically saying
egalitarian aspect of how Democrats hijack identity politics to kind of
they
sell
do
the same ideas and institutions, and they're just kind of running scared.
The Democrats hijack identity. I kind of want to say that intersectionalism brought them that. Now, I mean, they used to be just around being just kind of plain old crooked. Now they're kind of identitarian. Before it was to be like, hey, any minorities out there, you're with us, Forget the fact that we caused the problems that you're currently suffering, but you're with us now. So that was just plain double talk, not identitarianism.
Right.
Now it's
We're
identitarian.
afraid of the inclusion in our society of African Americans, Hispanic Americans,
We're afraid.
Women, gay folks.
Wait, let's recap. We are afraid of the inclusion in our society of African Americans, women, and gay folks. Okay, Russia. Inclusive? How'd the gay folks do there? Putin doesn't seem to like him. Don't know if there was any other person before him that kind of was terribly inclusive with them. A lot of African Americans. Well, that's probably a bad example. Let's go closer to Marx. Hitler? Ooh, definitely not inclusive on that one. No, in fact, he was quite a bit focused on just a certain shade of eyes and a certain shade of hair. Let's go further afield. China. China inclusive? Yeah, China was like, oh, no, they weren't actually. The Cultural Revolution, no, and Uyghurs, no, that they tend to not be very inclusive. In fact, they're just flat out racist. And those are the 3 largest examples where Marxism was sort of given its full gallop. But many other examples abound. My own country, Romania, not terribly inclusive during that time. Bulgaria, no. Bessarabia, okay, so Moldova, Ukraine, no, not so much. Latvia, no. Belarus, no. Kind of none. In fact, if I were to go the other way and say, forget Marxism, let's just say which country has been inclusive, I would say United States is the only country where multiculturalism has had a chance to work. Because, at least in the old days, when we could throttle immigration and sort of have waves of immigration and then allow some time to digest, it accepted lots and lots of different civilizations and it integrated them. And, this wonderful concept of like, once you put in your time and you're sort of here to work and you're an upstanding citizen, you lift up your right hand and you swear and now you're an American, then we don't give a shit where you came from. So, seems to me like the States kind of has that one. Maybe, I won't even say England, I'll say London, because England's had some diversity issues external to London, but maybe London's diversified. So yeah, I'm going to have to call BS on that one.
And so forth. If all of that frightens you, which it does, then
it's terribly frightening.
A term that says all of the things we don't like are secretly manipulated by Marxists. It's
the notice sort of this, like the continuous sleight of hand of sort of taking one unrelated thing to another and just making assertions without any support.
Mongering of the crudest sort.
Well,
And then
I don't know if you saw Jordan Peterson's debate
flying
with
in the
Slavoj
face.
Žižek. I thought you should have been debating Jordan Petersen. I think.
And that I thought was hilarious. I did watch the debate. Slavoj Žižek, not that I'm a terribly great fan of his, but at least he is somewhat engaging in that he is funny. He's got that whole breathing thing that kind of funky, but he has at least some folksy anecdotes. You know, he at least has definite command over the philosophical part of Marxism. And and I would consider him far superior in every sense of the word to Mr. Wolff. Yet, he ceded every single Marxism point, and eventually they ended up kind of meeting on a religious point. So I'm sorry, Abbie, but as much as you want to sit there vapidly fawning over the guy, you would have gotten fucking minced by Petersen.
I did.
Done a great job. Oh, I would love to see that.
Well, I actually did it a little bit. Let me tell you the story because you might enjoy it. A group of faculty.
And this is what made me want to do the video, his little story about.
In Boise, Idaho, about a year ago, sent me a bizarre invitation. Bizarre
only in that I hadn't expected it. Oh, so just unexpected.
Day-long conference, students and faculty at this university, devoted to the work of Jordan Petersen, who's
devoted to the work of. All right, so when Jordan Peterson's getting kicked out of every single university, Boise decides to invite him and devote a whole day to his work because they admire him so.
Influence out there in Idaho. And would I debate him since he has said publicly that no Marxists would dare debate him? So I found this amusing. I have to admit, I didn't know who Jordan Petersen was at this moment, but I liked the idea of someone saying such a silly thing. And I said,
such a silly thing. And sight I seen, I decided to accept. Now, let me just slightly push back on that. Now, Jordan Petersen has a certain amount of notoriety. And if one were to look at Mr. Wolff's videos, they're not necessarily experiencing that same level of notoriety. So here's a unique opportunity to latch on by making this little stunt. It's an opportunity to latch on for some, let's say, incremental publicity. That might be a motive. I absolutely have no evidence that would be his motive, but it would be logical to assume so. And the fact that your complete lack of, but of course, but why would it be of course? If someone invited me to debate him, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh yeah, anytime, any soon, without ever looking him up. And the fact that you're expecting us to believe that makes me kind of feel like you're kind of lying.
Of course I'll debate him. No, sight unseen, I will debate
sight
him.
unseen.
We can work out the
because that's always smart. And frankly, I don't know that I've ever seen Wolff debate anybody. Because his points are so puerile that they're just ridiculous.
We would have, as a featured part of this day, a debate between the two of you. Fine, I said. Oh, no, they said not fine. He withdrew.
Yeah,
So
I like
he was
that.
gone.
He withdrew. He didn't cancel. He didn't have a conflict. He withdrew. He tucked his tail between his legs and he just slunk away and crawled back under the rock whence he came. That's beautiful. That's what, like, I just don't, I'm not buying that.
Angered them by his
Angered them.
acceptance and then withdrawal, that they said, why don't you just come out here and analyze his work from a Marxist perspective? So I have, in this ersatz way, debated
This
it with
ersatz
Petersen.
thing, which is the other video where he just basically picks 3 points that Jordan never made and provides his counterpoint without counterpointing them. And then that didn't get any attention, so he goes to Abbie to get more press.
Slavoj Žižek, he talks about workers and bosses, and he actually says this, Richard. He says, quote, bosses would have to be stupid to exploit their workers.
Let's pause there because that's the most telling thing about the other person's mind. So, bosses, here's a simple statement, right? This is a simple statement as you can make. Bosses would have to be stupid to exploit their workers. This was said by Jordan Petersen. Now, is this statement said in a vacuum? No. It is said by a person living in a Western civilization that embraces free markets. This is not an attack on Marxism in any way. This is simply stating a fact that he believes is supported by reality. Now, this is what I interpret this statement to mean, being aware of, market forces as they exist in the West. Workers being oppressed, knowing that they have market choice, would then be free to go and seek other employment. Therefore, bosses would be stupid in seeking to oppress their workers because they would lose said labor. And then they would have to recompete for acquiring other means of labor. Now that is basically a compensating control that is offered by the free market system. It is not something that is offered by a Marxist economy, for example. So if your lens is either A, interpreting it through a existing Marxist economy, then that would be ludicrous. Or B, if you're interpreting it through that fictitious world that Marx was laboring under, that he thought, here's the conditions. So the conditions of a, mid-18th century England where, people were just coming out of poverty and expressing themselves in industrialization. Yeah, that would probably not be accurate. But in today's world, this is perfectly innocuous and straightforward. What is there hard to parse there?
I mean, what is your response to that statement and how it kind of mischaracterizes Marx's theory of exploitation of labor?
It is so ignorant, which I'll explain in a moment, that it takes your breath away, because
it's so ignorant that it takes your breath away. Here's what takes my breath away. This is not hard to comprehend, this concept. And it's staring you in the face. Because this man, Mr. Wolff, has had to secure employment for himself by speeches, I assume, or whatever. He does paid appearances, I would hope, as does she. And she's had to negotiate her employment with multiple entities. Yet, how would you not be able to recognize that? Has every single situation where she's been employed been an exploitative one? Now, I've been fortunate. As I've said, I grew up in America, but, came here fairly young and was able to matriculate quickly through school, and then, enjoyed success and climbed on up, was able to get into the tech industry, partly that into management, partly middle management to executive management. I actually ended up having a C-level executive position in the world's largest payment processor, financial industry. And as luck would have it, helped them go through an IPO, managed to lock in a decent amount of shares because I had some participation there, and then was able to sort of withdraw and stay on my ass for a bit. So of my range of experiences, I've been fortunate that I've sampled at the capitalism buffet and have also had a full sampling of the socialism buffet, all the way up to including, not necessarily, I've not experienced the dearth of socialism. I've not died, but I've gone hungry for a few days. I've had days when, looking in the fridge, there wasn't enough to make a sandwich. And I've also had good days in socialism. And I've had days here where I've been able to eat at 5-star restaurants for, continuous periods of time. So I've enjoyed those ranges of experiences. Specific to employment experiences, in the beginning, I've definitely had employment experiences where, the job sucked. And it felt like, you didn't have any choices because you had no skills, and your relative ability to parlay to another job was limited, but it was not impossible. So you kind of bit down and worked hard, and then eventually you clocked in some time, and then you had something to show on your resume, you went to the better job. And then, towards the latter half of my career, I enjoyed my work. And then towards the end of my career, my work took so much of my time willingly that, I wouldn't even call it a workaholic. I think I blew through that signpost to the point where I had no time to even do laundry at home because work was so preoccupying and enjoyable at the same time, yet stressful. At no point did I feel that I was doing something against my will. I may have had more choices at one time than another time, and even within the job I was making, I'm sure that within any single job that I've had, there was someone making for the same amount of labor probably 10% more than I was, and somebody doing the same amount of labor and doing 10% less than I was. I hope I was a good negotiator, but at no point did I ever feel, that I'm trapped. Now, in socialism, you would definitely feel that, because during my time there, now fortunately I was a minor, so I was excused from the work part. I had to be in school, but you're an adult and you're, say, walking the streets. Romania had 0% unemployment. So it wouldn't have been an uncommon event for you to walk and then a cop asked you, can I see your papers? Okay, where do you live, sir? Where do you work? If that didn't have an answer, you would get detained, questioned, and then you would be sent to whatever the next thing that needed filling was. And it could be, some menial task across the country, digging ditches. One of the great projects was basically curbing the path of the Danube, the largest river in Europe, because that was a project that Ceausescu got a bee in his bonnet about. Another one was wiping out half the capital to make room for Boulevard Victory of Socialism to go all the way to his grand palace that he was building, which was the largest folly in Europe. I think it was basically a kilometer with side square, still not finished. So yeah, there were lots of, gainful opportunities for employment, but you couldn't say that you had choice.
In that moment, he reveals that he never read what Marxism has to say or what Marx wrote.
I think he kind of did.
Capital, 3 volumes. First volume released 1867, so Petersen has had time to take a look at it.
I think he has read it.
In the beginning, Marx explains what he means by exploitation.
Here it comes.
And it's a simple mathematical thing. If
yes,
a
it
worker,
is.
during the time he or she works, produces more value for the employer than the employer pays them in wages, that's all exploitation means. Has nothing to do with
otherwise known as profit.
Words, treating somebody nicely or not nicely. Or
nor did he say that's not what the implication about treating nicely or not nicely.
An example. If you go look for a job with a private employer and you discuss it and you get to the point of how much am I going to get paid, and they say to you, well, we're going to pay you $20 an hour, and you agree to that, you know in the back of your mind what Marx is saying here. You know that the employer will never pay you $20 an hour to do something unless during that time you produce more than $20 worth of extra value when it comes time to sell whatever you're helping to produce. Otherwise, there's nothing in it for the employer, and he's not going to do it because he's a nice guy. He's doing it to make money.
Of
so
course, yeah, that terrible person.
You're worth more than that to him.
Now, and this is where the very first time I saw Mr. Wolff present, it created the same sort of, I wouldn't say outrage, let's say moderate outrage in me, because he presented this same puerile description of this is the complexity of his math. So I'm going to walk you through his more detailed presentation that he did in front of some college students, corrupting poor minds of today. So this is his approach, and he described it in these words, but let me just be specific, and he uses these terms. So one is commanded labor, or sometimes he uses living labor. Commanded labor is the work you're being paid to do. So, let's say the job is to assemble chairs. That's the job description. That's what you're getting paid for. That's the commanded labor. And then he does this little sleight of hand term called embodied labor, because it's the embodiment of someone else's labor in the past, also known as capital. And that's tools, materials, all that things that you need to be able to perform said job. And of course, that equals total labor. One might look at it as the cost of an item. Now, the value of the item is whatever you're selling it for, which would be the total labor plus the profit. And his whole contention is that the profit just goes in the pocket of the capitalist and labor gets zilch. And of course, that's called exploitation. And if it's put in that term, because you see, it's all about labor. Labor. It's only labor that's doing anything. I mean, what the hell is the capitalist participating? Capital, shit, that's just money, right? And we should take that away from the capital. There's another way to look at it. I mean, if you were to say, instead of embodied labor, call it sunk cost, because, you bought those things. You've already, those money ain't coming back, no matter how many chairs you build from that point on. And then if you look at the fact that it's the capitalist who paid for the labor and the sunk cost, and that would be the total cost of the item that came out of the capitalist pocket, right? And then you look at the other thing being the sale price, which is whatever you can sell it for, being the total cost plus profit, then that begins to tilt the picture a bit, because then it begins to introduce some of these little variables that he hates to highlight. Things like risk. Chair sells for $100, except for there's too many chairs on the market, and now they're all at 50. Now, if it costs you more than 50, you're taking it in the shorts. Now, are you taking the money back from the commanded labor guy? You're knocking on his door and say, hey, you worked for me yesterday, but I couldn't get the money, so give me $10 back. No, you're not doing that. Now, the idea that this market could use chairs, and maybe this kind of chair, or whatever, nifty product you're trying to do, that innovation, that killer app idea, is that the labor? No, that's still the capitalist, right? And who the fuck is this capitalist, right? Because it could very well just be some other poor labor schmuck who used this embodied labor that his other two labor parents had their entire lives, and they passed it to him, and he had this idea, and maybe he started a business, and that's how his embodied labor / capital came to be. Or maybe he just went and did his work and created a business plan, did some assessment, went to a bank, put his whole life in hawk to borrow the money, and now is taking a chance around this idea. And if it fails, like 2 out of 3 businesses do, he's screwed, but not the labor guy, because the labor guy got paid. All of that is mere ignored detail. But that's still math. I'm going to put a simple example, because, picture's worth 1,000 words. Might have seen this example. This is your driveway. Just bear with me. This is your driveway, it's your wife's car, and every day you come and you park your car right next to it. Okay, it's your driveway. Done this 1,000 times. Except today, boom, there's a guy. He's standing right there. He goes, stops you right before parking your car. He goes, hey, buddy, park your car for $5. Now, your typical reaction is going to be, get the fuck out of here. Not only am I wouldn't pay $5, I wouldn't pay $1. I wouldn't pay zip, because I'm perfectly capable of parking my own goddamn car. Right? That service to you at that point in time is worth 0. Nothing wrong with the labor. It's just not, it has no value then. It isn't necessary. It isn't value added. It doesn't help you in any way. Now some time passes, and you and your capitalist scum buddies get some capital, together, some dirty capital, and then you have this great idea where you're going to go to this place, wipe out a bunch of trees in the middle of nowhere, and build the most badass Indian casino you can think of. You got a guy who's got some, Indian heritage, you got the right laws, you got the right permits, beautiful resort, rich, appointed hotel rooms, exotic dancers, comedy talent coming in, slots as far as the eye can see, and just money's rolling in like a mother. But before you can drive into said complex, same guy, valet parking, $20 a day. Now, the very same person that would drive up in case A and see 0 value in that parking now wants to gamble. And if he's coming here from far away, you won't have a problem paying $20 for that task. In fact, if he's staying a day, he'll pay 20, but if he's staying 2 days, he'll pay 40, he'll pay 60, he'll pay 80, he'll pay however many days he wants to enjoy gambling. So now all of a sudden, something changed. Capital changed the desire of the market. The desire was 0, the desire now can go up to 80, it's variable. Now let's process from the perspective of the poor labor guy. He's sitting there going, God damn this capitalist mother. I park 100 cars a day working 10 hours. And let's say you're paying him $7 an hour. That's $2,000 this guy makes, and he's paying me $70. This is exploitation. Now, that's perfectly valid, right? It probably is from his perspective. Because what he's doing for $70, you're netting $2,000. I mean, you're grossing $2,000. So, you're netting $1,930 off of his effort. That's ridiculous, right? However, remove the capital. Replace this beautiful building right back to trees. Leave the valet guy right there. How much is that labor worth without the demand that you created? Oh, we're back to zero now. Now, the labor is no less qualified, no less competent, no less desirous, no less effort, no less anything. Nothing has changed with the labor. Yet it is now worthless. And that, my friends, is the concept of innovation, creating value where zero had been before, which is a complete whiff for Marx and all of the Marxists, because they see the world as a zero-sum game. You've got money, you took it for someplace. And the pie is fixed, and we just need to slice it different ways. And there's no thought to, hey, how about we grow the pie and create some value where none had been before, right? And guess what? The ones who create value collect the value, right? They do so usually together with others. They collect a lesser share or a similar share, and that's all based on a series of voluntary transactions. No guns being pointed to anybody's head. They all agree, and if this guy doesn't want to be valet for $7 an hour, either he leaves, and if no one wants to be a valet for $7 an hour, maybe the guy will offer 10 to the next one. But chances are, if the market supports it, there'll be another guy who wants that job. But it has nothing to do with some intrinsic value of the person as being gauged from the profit one makes. Because the profit one makes is entirely dependent on the situation of the market that that person has created. Did people want an iPhone? Steve Jobs decided he was going to make one and make them want one. You see the difference? He wasn't looking at the market and trying to sell them turnips when they needed turnips. It was create a product they didn't even know they needed. Did anybody get forced to buy one? Gladly shell out five to 600 every, two versions, every version for it. So there is a little difference.
And in that act, you're exploited. You're producing more than you're getting.
And he kind of goes on and on and on and on about this.
Young people, when they discover
I don't know if it's
Marx or by their own experience,
it discovered blah blah blah. Not sure if he's gonna actually have anything new in terms of conceptual.
What you are worth, because this system is built on there being a difference between what you add.
And it's just inflative language to basically say, you see what you call profit, and it's perfectly explainable. I'm going to use a yellow journalism word and slant it to you emotionally, so that way you can be upset and have a legitimate grievance, at least from your perspective, because you haven't thought it through.
For Mr. Petersen to then say, nobody would ever do that because it makes no sense.
Yes, he's right.
A level of unfamiliarity, which, nobody has to know Marx, why not? But if you go around celebrating yourself as a critic of Marx and you haven't the most basic understanding...
If you go around celebrating yourself as a critic of Marx and then you go criticizing Marx, then you've done what you're celebrating. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and you've offered no defense.
Every worker-employer relationship.
It's as if I went into his field. He's a professor of psychology, by the way, in Toronto. If I went into his field and said something moronic about Freud's ideas, he would be in the same position.
No. It's as if you went into your own field and said something moronic and he pointed it out, because it's not influenced by reality. It isn't as if you went into his. It's you actually said something moronic about reality because your perspective, your field of perspective influences that alteration of reality that makes it a moronic statement.
Position is correcting me,
but you notice how
I wouldn't do that because
if you've watched Jordan Peterson, at no point does he lower himself to moronic and childish and this. No, he simply just argues factual.
In trivial ways,
and
never debating them the way he did with me. That
he would be minced if he went up against. Oh my God, he would be minced. And
it's kind of the same logic as
Petersen would do it.
CEOs would never pursue profits at the expense of the environment. That would be.
Hold on a minute. No, it's not. CEOs would never pursue profits off the environment if they were compensatory controls already in place, like, say, an EPA watching them, right? Something that knew that they couldn't get away with. They could get away with it? Of course they would. hence the need for compensatory controls. So no, not exactly the same.
That's right. Who wants to destroy the environment after 100 years of evidence to the contrary?
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Well, another thing that he says, and this is the last thing I'll say about Jordan Peterson, another thing that he says is kind of justifying hierarchies, that hierarchies are biologically, they're natural, and that we should just accept them. What is your response when you hear this as you...
So now, so far she's not incorrect. But hierarchies are natural. You should accept them. Okay. What's your response when you hear this as used to justify the gross inequalities under global capitalism? At no point did he use that. He said, we build a hierarchy. Hierarchies tend to displace the people at the bottom. Always says that, every time. So, you need to focus on that because that's a real problem. The way we've done that so far is by specialization. We create another merit hierarchy, and hopefully they perform better there, and another, and another. And he also, by the way, says that that's why it's important to also have the creative types, the lefties, involved in society, because they always focus on the ones that are basically disenfranchised. At no point did he say, accept hierarchies and accept the poor.
Reaction is to remind everybody of how slavery...
And then he goes to the S word.
We were told in the American South and in other parts of the world where slavery is...
I could just go into a tirade about the similarities of life in, in Russia and in other parts of socialist life, but let's leave that for another time. But that's another yellow journalism comparison. Yeah, there's natural, blah, blah, blah. No, he's actually talking about biological natural, not about some fabricated position, but okay. And I think that's that. Now, let's look at the video that he was trying to hawk with this previous video.
To some things that were said by a Canadian psychologist by the name of Jordan Petersen, who teaches at the University of Toronto.
Does he?
I'm not going to be talking about the psychology he teaches
or
that he preaches, because that's not my area of expertise.
Obvious.
Just as it's clear that Marxism is not his.
I don't know about that.
He has made statements about Marxism, despite not knowing very much about it, as is evident from what he said.
Okay, see, I wouldn't mind a statement like this if he then went and clearly articulated, here's the statement he makes that shows his complete lack of understanding based on the following things, by which he would demonstrate his own, mastery of understanding, explaining it in a way that would be believable and not contradictory to, the audience, and there reinforce his point. But making these assertions, just dangling assertions out there with no support, that's just a trade of the left.
These have included daring Marxists to debate with him,
just
for the record, anytime, anywhere, as long as we can work out the details.
Yeah, I know. You'd love to.
At this end. So what is it that's wrong with what Mr. Petersen has to say about Marxism? Well,
but let me say, anytime, anywhere. Why would he? Because if your arguments in this video, and let me do a little foreshadowing, yeah, they're just as shitty as the previous video. Why the fuck would he? Because if a nobody like me can tear him apart, how the fuck are you gonna just survive being on stage with him?
It's partly that he's recycling old Cold War
Oh, I love this one.
stuff. The Cold War was over in 1989.
Yep. He's recycling Cold War stuff? No. Actually, you're being generous. He's recycling 1800s stuff. Because, see, he's accused Marx of Marxism, and then communists of communism, and then postmodernists of postmodernism, Maoists of Maoism, etc. What he's done is he's criticized all the evolutions of Marx vis-a-vis the epoch that they took place in. That's not an argument. That's not a counter. That's not even good enough to be wrong.
Most of us have moved on around the world.
Oh, you would love that. Most of us. So this has been sort of that. Nothing to see here, people. Move along. Like, why harp in the past? Okay, so we killed a few 100 million people. Don't worry about it. It's all better now. This is not your grandpa's Marxism. This is like new and improved Febreze.
Seems to be stuck, and he's stuck with.
No, he's appropriately adjusted.
Telling us that we should not be interested in Marxism. In fact, it's
Yep.
kind of immoral,
Fair.
in his words, to be interested in Marxism. in view of what Stalin did in Soviet
Yeah,
Russia.
that's valid.
Well, okay, Stalin did terrible things.
Oh,
in
I'm glad you
Soviet
admit that.
Russia. However,
You know,
Marxism
what's strange is a lot of people actually feel that, you know, they sort of feel sort of a, you know, kind of a wet dream desire to like defend Stalin. I mean, have you read like Nellie Orr's dissertations on Stalinism? It's kind of like she whacks fucking giddy. There's some Stalinists that you go, are you human? Huh.
of the earth. It's been going on for 150 years, and a lot more than what happened in Russia under Stalin over a period of 15 or 20 years has to be taken into account if you're going to make an assessment of Marxism.
Well, let's make an assessment, just a short one since we're harping on Stalin. One of the things that Marx missed and Lenin missed, and it sort of came back to bite him in the ass, was he was so focused on those gosh darn old proles, those proletariats, which would be industrial workers in cities. Hence the name of the Soviets were little committees being formed in the cities about them, you know, workers. Except Russia wasn't that industrial. After they went and organized all that shit, they were kind of left with zip. I mean, you know, some movement, but, you know, nothing to write home about. Now there's a way to revisit slavery. In Russia, up until the Bolsheviks, there was this beautiful Tsarist system. Tsar, Russian version of Caesar, a throwback from the Roman Empire, because the Russians kind of had it in their head that they were the third Rome, Moscow. You see, Rome fell, and sort of the baton was passed to Constantinople, and then one of the last emperors sent his daughter, married one of the guys in Novgorod or whatever. Therefore, they kind of saw that as them being the next Caesar, next Rome, or the Tsar. So they were sort of, you know, their own version of divine right. And if you were a plebe, you were just a peasant, you were born across this piece of land. And here's the thing, it wasn't your land. Your family sort of had this deal with the landowner where he kind of decided how much of the crop he'll keep and how much you will. And that could change subject to, you know, no notice. And you didn't have the right to travel and establish yourself anywhere else. So while you were not called a slave, you were a serf, a land-bound serf. And that was the state of play for most of Russian history. In fact, slavery was widely practiced in Russia because Slavs were pretty. And many, you know, Asian cultures loved to take some. And then some of the landowners, you know, they weren't above, you know, grabbing a few and selling them. But okay. And eventually some tsarinas had a little bit of a change in heart. And there'd be some, you know, laxing of the rules and then some tightening of the rules. And then the Bolsheviks happened. And that's when it all changed. Because they all got freed. Here's how they got freed. Those few guys that within this oppressive system managed to, you know, have like some kind of a semi-decent landowner, and they scrimped and they saved their little money and maybe bought themselves a little plot of land, and they kind of elevated themselves, made themselves sort of, you know, masters of their own little mid-destiny. They had these things called kolkhozes. They were gospodin. They were just hard-working people that, you know, had a few cows, had a house, had a whatever. So Stalin came around because he didn't have enough converts to his cause. Now he needed kind of a class to blame. And when trying to convert the whole agricultural society, who are you going to turn them against? You turn them against these kolkhoz owners who were just marginally better than the other poor peasants. And along with being marginally better, had the most of the production of agriculture because they were slightly better at it, more skilled, whatever. Off with their heads because, you know, dialectical materialism. Now that had this funny effect that literally the very next year, there was not enough food. And I don't mean a little bit not enough food. And of course, Stalin fed his surrounding areas because he didn't want to revolt right under his nose. Little periphery places like Ukraine didn't get that much food. But, you know, hey, the Soviets helped because, you know how they helped in Ukraine? Because they had, you know, 6 million people starving to death. They printed flyers to inform people that eating your kids is not right. So let that sink in. eating your children is a no-no. And it was necessary to print flyers to inform the people of that. You think people didn't know that? Or do you think the conditions were that horrible? Now, why would we want to skip part of that? Because it wasn't that long ago, and it's kind of a big one.
To use the one example that is really horrible over there as the judgment on Marxism would be about the same sense as saying Christianity should be.
Let's stop right there. To use the one example, that over there, would be the same as saying Christianity is the same as the Catholic Inquisition. Okay, that might seem fair. Except that, whereas Stalin truly had some, let's just say, bad planning, 6 million, then some people getting sequestered and killed off, 15, 20 million. Let's go, back a version. Now you got Hitler. So Hitler's what? 60 million? And that one didn't work out well for Marxism. Let's go forward a generation. Maoism. Well, we don't have full numbers on that, but estimates are about 100 million. In fact, every single place that socialism was implemented, every single place, it failed horribly. So it's not like comparing Catholic Inquisition versus Christianity, unless, of course, every time Christianity ever got implemented, it resulted in Catholic Inquisition. Yeah, that would be fair. No, not the same.
Dismissed.
Let's see what other ones.
Catholic Inquisition or the destruction of the Native American
Woo!
population.
That's a beautiful one. Wait. So, those darn Mayflower people. So, Plymouth Rock. Now, what did they do between Plymouth Rock and, say, the War of Independence? Because that was kind of a long period. Were they just actively butchering? Because I remember there was this, what was that thing called? The French Indian War, right? 1.5 million Brits, 75,000 French guys who kept going inland and just kept recruiting Indians to fight and just basically provoke into fighting the Brits. So, okay, granted, the French were Christian too, but wasn't like the Indians were unwilling to fight, and they kept raiding and there was a continuous, several decades of just continuous bloody war. And by going deeper and deeper inland, they exposed them to smallpox. And by the way, skip past that little story of smallpox blankets, because no one had any clue about the germ theory of disease back then. So the smallpox they got was just, they came out of the mountains, got it, and went back to the mountains and gave it on. But it's that's a little bit yellow journalistic to put that one, because it wasn't Christians, because, they didn't go there as Christians and said, because we're Christians, we're going to kill you. They went there as people from a continent that was literally overpopulated, that had forested their every timber that they had, and they were just looking for, other places to inhabit, as every nation was doing everywhere else, as the Indians themselves did to other Indians before our arrival.
Or the Holocaust against Jews, gays, and so forth.
Whoa! Oh, okay. Pause that one. Now, you might want to say that Hitler was a Christian, but I'm going to have to push back on that. Yes, they had little buttons that says, God is with us. But Hitler wasn't necessarily highlighting that whole Christian history of the Germans. He was going back to, Teutonic times, Valkyrie times, frickin' Thor. I mean, he was going back to Nordic roots. So it didn't seem to me like he was all that Christian-like. So, and he didn't kill the Jews because they were Jews. He killed them because they had money. And he wanted it. In fact, why would, the gays, they might have been Christian. I mean, he also killed, he didn't like the Slavs much because they didn't fit the racial profile. They were Christian. Didn't have a problem with that. He fought Christians in the other countries. Wasn't a real Christian thing. It was more of a, I'm going to pick my own version. I mean, he took the page right out of fucking Andrew Jackson's book. I'm going to pick an indigenous population that I have in my country and use them as my oppressive target. Something that socialism needs to have. A target, an identity group to oppress. Because that's the little known secret about socialism. It's parasitic. You need something to take money from. The problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money. You can't start from zero. You have to start from somebody having made a success.
Germany, and on and on and on. 2 world wars by capitalist Christian countries.
My God.
Each other might all qualify for the kinds of argument Mr. Petersen.
2 world wars.
We don't make those
And he says 2 capitalist countries. No. There was one capitalist country over yonder. And then there was like this National Socialist one. There was this other communist one. Yeah, another few capitalists thrown in there too. But let's not skip past the non-capitalist countries because they were kind of all on one side.
No sense. And Mr. Petersen oughtn't to do that with Marxism. The only other thing to say is he seems to reduce Marxism, when he actually talks about it, to the problem of inequality, that some people are rich and others are poor.
No.
He deals with that by the very sophisticated notion that poor people's anger at rich.
Oh, the sarcasm is rich. No, he doesn't deal with it. He doesn't reduce it to an inequality problem. In fact, he laments the fact that you guys recast equality of opportunity into equality of outcome. You've heard that one before, right? Stop me if you know. And he doesn't talk about that poor people are angry at the rich. No, that's really not. He talks about people, some people are poor and some people are rich. But that doesn't mean that the poor people are poor because the rich people are rich.
Rich is their envy of the success.
Now you're mixing his words with Nietzsche's words. And that wasn't exactly envy. It was basically the weak, the ones that have chosen not to apply themselves, the ones that want to look for oppression, feel ressentiment, resentment for the upper class because they see success and they envy not having it. Well, that is a human flaw. I would say that that exists in, say, I don't know, intellectual socialists that look at some, trumped up car mechanic who just managed to be successful and is making more money than I'm making as a teacher over here at College U.
An insult to those folks who are critical of inequality, but apparently Mr. Petersen doesn't worry about that. So
yeah, he's so callous.
Inequality is indeed a social problem, but
yeah.
It has nothing particularly to do with Marxism. People have been talking about the problem of inequality for thousands of years before there ever was.
And Karl Marx talked about it too and provided no solutions.
The whole point of Marxism was to explain why inequality under capitalism didn't go away.
Oh, is that what Marxism is? It's really just a polemic on capitalism? Just to say, look, those capitalism guys didn't fix it? I thought there was sort of a solution there. Is there a solution in Marxism?
And let's remind everybody, capitalism comes into the world in the French and American revolutions, talking about being better than feudalism, because under capitalism, you see, we are free, we are equal, we are democratic.
Here's another sleight of hand.
And all the rest of it. Capitalism was to bring, in the words of the French Revolution, liberty.
And that's another sleight of hand. Okay, let's stop there. True. Those words were part of the French Revolution. He is right. But what he isn't right about is that there was a sharp difference. Now, here comes the age of reason, and we have come such a long way. We have all of these distinguished philosophers and thinkers and all of that good shit. And here it is. Here's what happens in America, with French support, no less. Those same amazing thinkers, and take those guys off the Voltaire side. Voltaire was more of a humanist. He still had a certain appreciation of divinity and the value of man. Endowed, rights are not given, they are protected by the nation. Okay, so off we go with our freedom and we get it. And, establish a pretty decent kind of country. So France goes, hold my beer. And they do the same thing. Now, they take a while. They kill a few kings, have that terror we talked about. But then when they do their little history here, it's, the rights come from you only have value if you're a benefit to the community, and rights are only from the nation. So therefore, they can be taken away at any point. Yeah, that's not capitalism. Sorry, that's collectivism. That's kind of like, the main difference. You ought to be able to point that one out.
And fraternity. Well, as you know, and I know, and even Mr. Petersen must.
Yeah, he does know. And you know too, which means you're lying,
but we don't have,
or you're just unable to notice the difference. I don't know.
Not even close.
I don't know. It's tough to gauge if actually he's able to notice the difference and he's bullshitting. Because I gotta think that he's 77. Somebody must have challenged him on this. I mean, no one must have just fucking accepted all this bullshit for 77 years since he's been teaching it. And it doesn't seem like he's evolved it, because every time I've seen his speech, it's kind of on the same thing. Yeah, blah, 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 blah. So, in any case, that's that. So, I'm going to stop here because I think he just goes on the same note. But, again, so the question is he aware of just the framing of logic and the fact that he's continuously doing a swap out of his thesis and not accepting a response? And how would he do I can't see this guy actually being able to stand up in a debate if he chooses to actually abide by the rules of a debate. I can see him attempting to filibuster, so that way his point, he never has to stop, breathe, and respond. But if it's a traditional, debate, or if Jordan pauses him and basically points him back to the rules and calls him on responding, this guy's fucking toast. He will fold like a cheap rag. So anyways, that's my take.